Greenhouse gas emissions are growing at an alarming rate, and it's our fault, right? Wrong. Our next guest provides the facts about greenhouse gas emissions in North Carolina and the U.S. as part of a recent John Locke Foundation research brief. John Sanders is Senior Fellow in Regulatory Studies and Research Editor. John, you took a look at some of the data, not just what's being said about greenhouse gas emissions, and found a quite different story than what has been put forward, at least in the popular media. Let's start with one of your earliest points, and that is the changing mix in the energy sources in use here in North Carolina. Tell us about that, please.
Yeah, thanks to the fracking revolution in the early 2000s, which resulted in cheap and price efficient natural gas. The changeover in electricity generation in North Carolina has been dramatic. At the beginning of 2000, natural gas was just a fraction, not even it was a 0.9% of electricity generation, and coal, meanwhile, was almost 2/3. It was 62%. So 2/3 of our electricity in North Carolina in natural gas, in North Carolina was in coal. Nuclear was number 2 at 32%. In the ensuing years, nuclear has held steady. It's still at 32%, and that's a good thing because nuclear is completely clean fuel. It has no emissions, and it also is the most efficient electricity generating source that we have. But in the meantime, natural gas started to elbow out coal, not only from the first position, but now coal is at third, and natural gas went from 0.9% to now 31.4%. So we have replaced 2/3 of our electricity generation from coal, which has more emissions than nuclear and natural gas, with now nuclear and natural gas.
And the consequence of that is, as you point out in the research brief, North Carolina's greenhouse gas emissions have been falling all century, and you say dramatically.
Yes, it is a very dramatic decline. Carbon dioxide is down 40.4% total. And if you look at it per capita, considering how many people have been coming to North Carolina, that's an even more dramatic decline. It's down 54.1%. Seriously dangerous emissions of the nitrogen oxides and sulfur dioxide, and things that are dangerous pollutants regulated under the Clean Air Act. Nitrogen oxides are down 74.2%. And 80.1% per capita, and sulfur dioxide is down 92.9% total and 94.6% per capita since 2000. Those are tremendous declines.
I liked your scientific response to this. In the brief, you say, "Wow." That's your one-word response. But then after that, you mentioned that this has been taking place largely because of market forces, not because of government policy.
Yes, it was market forces that led to the fracking revolution. And it's not just the changeover from natural gas. I mean, we, in the United States and in free societies, people seek more efficient technologies. They are seeking a better way, faster, cheaper, more efficient, more effective. So consumer preferences and technological change have been driving more efficient use of all of our resources, and people are favoring less carbon intensive goods and services. And also, as a result of increasing wealth in this society, we are seeing a greater and greater expanding service sector as opposed to these heavy industrial sectors. So all of these things combined are causing our emissions to decline. And that's great news, and nobody seems to know about it.
And one of the other things that you touch on is this question that some people may bring up. Well, hey, isn't part of this because of our increasing reliance on solar?
You would think because of everything that's been said, but if government solar is driving and playing a role in these reductions, it's really small, and it may not even be there for two reasons. One, very little of our electricity generation is from solar. It's just over 5% in the most recent numbers. But also, solar is an intermittent source of energy. It can't be reliable. I think it was really instructive that when Governor Roy Cooper wanted to put solar on his Nash County property, the solar applicant stated in its application, quote, "Solar is an intermittent energy source and therefore the maximum dependable capacity, the best you can hope for, that you can depend on is 0 megawatts." So it's very intermittent. And as Dan Way showed in a North State Journal article back in 2019, Duke had to ask for an allowance from the Division of Air Quality for increased emissions at some of its plants, not because of increased emissions in general, but because they were being used for backup generation for solar, which is a very inefficient use of those backup plants, causing them to emit more. And they even said, quote, that nitrogen oxide emissions would be lower if there were no solar power on the electric grid.
You alluded to this earlier, but this information that we're talking about is the type of thing you're not really going to see reported on much. And you tie that into the fact that one of the things that's going forward is an increasing push for the government to get involved, to take more steps to push things like solar. What is the tie-in you see to the fact that we're not really hearing much of the facts and the government is pushing for more government mandated energy policy?
Well, my concern is that if people don't know that we're actually doing a great job, we're going to be more inclined to fall for these government expansions and these massive government interventions, which, as I alluded to earlier, may actually have negative implications on net for climate emissions. It certainly would have negative implications for affordability of electricity, which would harm society overall. It would make people worse off overall, especially the poorest among us. But also, electricity is an input in pretty much everything that's made and produced in this nation. So the cost of everything would end up going up. We would be left worse off.
And so one of the things that you're hoping to do with this report is just make people aware that, hey, North Carolina, the US, we're doing a great job on emissions.
Yeah, you mentioned the US. No one seems to know that the US is leading the world in cutting CO2 emissions. And we have been. And a lot of this is also due to the fracking revolution. But it's not just because of that. It's because of technological change, consumer preferences, market forces. But the downside of it is, while we're cutting, China and India, especially China, are doubling the amount that we've cut. So it's like that old cartoon where one guy is digging a hole, and other people are digging a hole nearby and are throwing dirt into his hole. We're cutting emissions, and China is more than doubling the amount of stuff that we're cutting. So we're not the problem.
Well, it's certainly a situation where people need to know more about the facts, and you can learn some of these facts, including good charts and data beyond what we've just talked about, at the John Locke Foundation's website, johnlocke.org. It's a research brief with the headline, "Greenhouse Gas Emissions Continue to Plummet in North Carolina." Its author is John Sanders. He is Senior Fellow in Regulatory Studies and Research Editor at the John Locke Foundation. Thanks so much, John.
Thank you, Mitch.